Well, if you really want to divide the CrossFit community, it's pretty simple. Just go after Dave Castro. The PFAA, or Professional Fitness Athletes Association, have sent a list of demands to CrossFit, and well, people have opinions, particularly on the final demand, that Dave Castro must go. In fact, if you read the comments on their original post, or on the posts of others that have chosen to talk about this subject, you will see that once again the community is split. And that shouldn't really come as any surprise to us, because we saw exactly the same things with the CrossFit Games choosing to continue, or with individual athletes choosing whether or not they wanted to continue at the Games or withdraw from competition. But let's just back up a second and look at these demands in general, and also some of the questions that they raise. For example, are the PFAA in a position to make demands? And who exactly are they representing? Now, usually it's at this moment I would say, if you've got opinions on this topic, please leave them in the comments below. And while you're down there, and if you're not subscribed to the channel, you could do that, or give the video a like. Anything you can do to help me, I really appreciate it. But let's just start by refreshing our memory on the exact demands that the PFAA have made to CrossFit. So number one, they demand an appropriate level of transparency between CrossFit and the PFAA regarding their third-party investigation as to the death of Lazar Jukic, and subsequent changes made to protect all athletes going forward. Number two, they demand that CrossFit create an independent safety team to liaise with the PFAA on an ongoing basis. And the third and most controversial, they demand that Dave Castro be removed from his position in the sports team. So these are the demands. But for me, the obvious first question is, are the PFAA in a position to make demands of CrossFit? Because when we think about the difference between a request and a demand doesn't really give the person the option of saying no. Usually there's an ultimatum. Usually it is from someone that is in a position of power or authority that can make that demand. So what power do the PFAA have over CrossFit that enables them to make these demands? Well, it would be easy to say they control the athletes. So they could encourage athletes to skip or boycott CrossFit events, the Games, for example. But in reality, would that work? When we think of the way CrossFit feeds athletes into the Games, the Open, quarterfinals, semi-finals, and then the Games, there's a huge pool of athletes, and no doubt there will be people that will happily swoop in and take those spots if they're available. Now, what would be the result? Yes, we would probably see a dip in quality of the athletes that are making it to the CrossFit Games. However, if I'm a CrossFit Games level athlete and I know that it's going to be a considerably weaker field this year, maybe I'm going to give it a go and make a run for the podium. And how many might feel that way, particularly if they don't exactly align their views with the PFAA. What would be interesting to see is if another event decided to go head to head with the CrossFit Games. So those athletes that are choosing to boycott, maybe they'll go to this event. If they had a big enough prize purse, maybe they could pull away some of the other athletes as well. Perhaps if they get enough of those athletes, they're going to be able to grab some of the sponsors and vendors that would be usually at the CrossFit Games, and really they could give them a run for their money. But how many names do they have to get in order to tip the scales that people are going to shift their focus from the Games, the original, to whatever this new event is? And then we have to ask, well, who exactly do the PFAA represent? Again, the easy answer is, it's the athletes. But we've just said there's this enormous pool of athletes, and they're coming from all over the world. So do they all align their thinking with the PFAA? Again, if we look to the comments on social media, it doesn't seem to be the case. So already, before we focus in on the individual demands themselves, we see that things are a little bit murky just to begin with. But let's break down these demands. So the first is transparency in the third-party investigation. Now, I'm sure we all want that. We want to know who is responsible, what exactly happened behind the scenes. But of course, many people already have formed their opinions. They feel they know who is responsible. Maybe it was the budget cuts to the Games that Don was talking about, so Don is responsible. Maybe it's the programming or Dave's desire to push people further and further within the sport of CrossFit, so he is responsible. But maybe the investigation could reveal somebody else is at fault, somebody we've never even heard of. Would people be happy to hear that? Or are they hoping that the investigation just confirms the opinion they've already formed? Or what about this second demand, this independent safety team? Well, will that work both ways? For example, are they also going to be protecting CrossFit and their image? Because what if an athlete has an injury, something that could be made worse by competing at the CrossFit Games? Will they make sure that they don't compete? Because if they do and their injury becomes worse and they have to withdraw from competition, well, that reflects badly on CrossFit's image. And then will individual athletes be happy to trust the PFAA to make decisions, to decide what is safe and what isn't for them? Again, we go back to it being a huge pool of athletes from different backgrounds, from different sports that are now all doing the same thing. They might feel that the PFAA are too careful or too careless. Who knows? But ultimately, everybody is talking about the third point, and for good reason: the removal of Dave Castro. Now, for some, Dave Castro is the best thing to happen to CrossFit since Greg Glassman, particularly if we are talking about the CrossFit Games. For others, he is absolutely the worst thing to happen to CrossFit, particularly after this year's CrossFit Games. Now, no matter which camp you are in, you cannot deny all the good work that Dave has done for CrossFit, for the affiliates, for the methodology, and of course, for the games. And yes, he is probably the most passionate person about the CrossFit Games. He probably cares about it more than anybody else. It very much is his baby. But does that make him infallible or irreplaceable? Well, no, of course not. And it may be that after the investigation is finished, if he is the man responsible, that he does need to be removed from that position. But that's after the investigation. So here is a little issue, right? We're asking for transparency in an investigation, which means we want to know the truth. And yet point 3 is us deciding that we already know the truth. Dave is the man responsible. We don't trust him. We want him removed. So wouldn't it be better to wait for point 1 to be fulfilled, to have that transparency of the investigation, to be absolutely sure who is responsible before we start making demands as to what should happen to those people? Otherwise, we've already decided that Dave is responsible. So we don't want transparency in the investigation. We want the investigation to prove the point we've already decided. And then, if Dave Castro is removed from the sport, well, that doesn't necessarily mean he has to be removed from CrossFit, does it? There's still a lot of good that Dave could be doing for the affiliates, for the methodology, things that are arguably more important than the CrossFit Games. But even in that case, we would want to wait until we had answers from the third-party investigation. And ultimately, we are in a wait-and-see mode. We need to wait and see what happens with the investigation. We need to wait and see how CrossFit respond to these demands. And then we need to wait and see what the PFAA do if their demands are not met. Or if they are met, what do the individual athletes decide to do? And how will this affect other competitions? We've already seen other competitions working with the PFAA, but can the PFAA work with every single competition around the world that are holding CrossFit events, whether they are licensed or unlicensed? It's going to be very hard when we think again about the global nature of CrossFit. So then, does a competition that isn't part of the PFAA or doesn't have their stamp of approval, will we start to hesitate to be involved with that competition, even though it might just be a logistical matter and that they haven't had the opportunity to get together with the PFAA? Only time will tell. Yes, we just have to wait and see. Is this the future direction of the sport? Or is this just something that's driving a wedge between competitors, between athletes, and ultimately between the community?